There is a kind of pain that cannot be measured by wounds or painkillers. It is the feeling of lying in a quiet room, with no one calling your name, no eyes looking at you, and no voice filling the void. Loneliness is not necessarily the absence of others, but the feeling of being cut off from the flow of life. As if the world keeps turning, and you are left behind, silent and invisible. Have you ever experienced it? The feeling that everyone around you seems to be living fully, laughing, talking, connecting, loving, while you struggle to understand why you are being pushed aside. A question echoes in your head, repeating like a slow but heavy drumbeat. Why me? We live in a world filled with people, but the feeling of disconnection has never been more prevalent. Lightning-fast connections online, fleeting conversations that leave no trace, handshakes that leave a void. Amidst the noise, loneliness becomes more than just an emotion. It becomes a kind of existential, a kind of lostness without a map. And then people begin to wonder, am I being punished? Is there something wrong with me that makes others turn away? Is silence a sentence? But what if I told you that nothing is wrong? That silence, that separation is not a punishment, but an invitation, a door. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists in human history, once said, "Isolation is not a curse. It is a necessary condition for any form of creativity, growth, or personal realization." Jung did not see loneliness as a social failure. He saw it as a ritual, an initiation. You may be in that moment, the moment when everything around you fades away. You can no longer see the road ahead. The familiar noises fade away. You are left alone with yourself. But instead of seeing it as an end, try asking a different question. What is beginning? Maybe the separation you are experiencing is not a rejection of life. Maybe it is life whispering to you, pulling you away from the crowd, so you can hear something more important, yourself. We are used to following the voices of others. From a young age, we learn to live to be accepted, to fit into the norm, to not disappoint anyone. But in those moments of solitude, when there is no one left to please, you are confronted with something original, something pure, and sometimes it scares you, because in that silence, you cannot hide. You cannot pretend. There is no embellishment. You are left with yourself. No role, no audience. This is the beginning, not of a collapse, but of a journey that few are brave enough to complete. But those who do will never return the same. Jung once said that people can only become whole if they are willing to face their own shadow, the parts they try to deny, the pains they have not named, the stories they have forgotten they have lived. And solitude is where that mirror appears, unvarnished, unhidden. You are standing on the threshold of truth. Not the truth the world tells you, but the truth that lies deep within you, of who you were, of who you are becoming. And this journey, though it begins quietly, can lead to a freedom that no crowd can bring. So if you are lonely, really lonely, don't turn away. Stay a while. Maybe life is calling you into yourself. And there, if you have the courage to look, you may find what the world can't give you, yourself, whole and undivided. When loneliness comes, it doesn't knock softly. It hits like a silent storm, sweeping away the familiar. Calls become less frequent. Texts go unanswered. Appointments quietly disappear. And you start to wonder, what did I do wrong? Why are people drifting away? The feeling of being forgotten doesn't come from the absence of people around you, but from the feeling that you don't belong anywhere. At this stage, the mind starts to make assumptions. Maybe you're not interesting enough. Maybe you're not good enough. Maybe you're being quietly rejected by the world. And the biggest pain isn't that no one is around, but that you feel left behind in your own life. Everyone around you seems to be moving on. They have jobs, they have dates, they hug, they look at each other warmly. And you, like a lost soul, are standing on the sidelines, only able to observe, but unable to touch. And as that comparison grows, it eats away at your self-confidence. But what most of us don't see is that the isolation that life brings in these moments isn't to abandon you, but to strip you of what no longer belongs to you. Like a shell that's too tight, you can't grow into the same space. And to truly begin your journey of growth, you need space, where there are no applause lines, no judgmental looks, no roles to play, just you. And that's what makes the first stages of loneliness so harsh. It takes away what you once relied on, but doesn't show you what comes next. The mind is disoriented. The heart aches because there's no one to share it with. The body is exhausted from fighting the feeling of invisibility, as if you no longer exist in anyone's eyes. But in those very moments, something sacred begins to happen quietly. A shift, a separation, a deliberate withdrawal from life. Carl Jung did not see this isolation as a tragedy. He called it a withdrawal from the world into oneself. And you are not the first to experience it. On the journeys of great people, from spiritual masters to thinkers, the most important moments come, not from the crowd, but from the silence. Think of the Buddha, who left his palace to meditate under the Bodhi tree, alone in absolute silence. Think of Jesus, who walked into the desert for 40 days without anyone to accompany him. Think of Carl Jung himself, who withdrew from the world, shut himself off from the outside world, and wrote the Red Book, where he recorded his journey into his own subconscious. These people were not left behind. They were called. And if you're in that place, where the world seems to have turned its back on you, you may be called too, not to disappear, but to show up in a whole new way. Silence can be scary, but sometimes it's the only way we can hear our true voice. And that voice may have been drowned out by expectations, noise, and compromises we've had to make to survive. Stop and feel. You're not abandoned. You're being separated from the fake. You're on the threshold of transformation. And even if you can't quite see what's coming, it's in this emptiness that the seeds of a new you are beginning to form. You may not believe it right now, but stay a little longer, because the most profound change often begins where there seems to be nothing. As you delve deeper into loneliness, a strange phase begins. It's no longer just a feeling of emptiness or abandonment. Now, you begin to appear to you, not the version that's been edited to fit in with society, but the original, unpolished, unstaged version. And the first thing you encounter isn't the light, but the shadow. Carl Jung called it the shadow. It's the sum total of everything you've ever denied about yourself. The anger you never acknowledged, the jealousy you kept hidden, the mistakes you tried to forget, the desires you denied, the dark side you thought you didn't have. In everyday life, you can hide them with work, relationships, social media, and entertainment. But in loneliness, there's nothing to lean on. The shadow emerges. It's not gentle. It's not pleasant. At first, it can be terrifying. You find yourself thinking things you once thought were not allowed. You feel angry for no reason. You burst into tears over a seemingly forgotten memory. You have strange, intense, emotional dreams. That's not a breakdown. That's the mind opening up. We live in a culture of escape. If you feel a little sad, there are dozens of ways to ignore it. A video, a text, an invitation to a coffee, a mild addiction to trick the mind. We call it entertainment, but sometimes it's just a temporary escape from yourself. When you have nowhere to hide, when silence becomes the dominant space, the repressed parts of you begin to find their way to the surface. And this is the most important threshold of the inner journey. Do you dare to face yourself? Facing your shadow doesn't mean blaming yourself, nor does it mean digging yourself out to punish yourself. It is the courageous act of looking at the truth, that you are not perfect, that you have broken parts, that you have hurt and have been hurt. But instead of turning away from those parts, you look them in the eye. Jung believed that the shadow is not the enemy. On the contrary, it is the part of you that you need to reconnect with in order to become whole. The shadow is only dangerous when it is denied. When it is acknowledged, it becomes a bridge. A person becomes truly free only when they are no longer afraid of themselves, when they can say, "I know that I have a shadow, and I accept it as a part of me." Accepting your shadow does not make you a bad person. It makes you a real person. A person whose light does not come from removing the shadow, but from understanding where the shadow is and how it affects you. It's like when you stand in a forest, in the dead of night, with no lights, no directions. You begin to learn to feel the space intuitively, to learn to see in the dark. Loneliness is like that. It teaches you to see with feeling, not form. And when you stay in that forest long enough, something begins to change. Emotions no longer overwhelm you like waves. Painful memories no longer suffocate you as they used to. Instead, you begin to understand why they're there. Every anger has a story behind it. Every fear has a message. The shadow begins to talk to you, not with reason, but with deep intuition. This is why many people can't continue on their journey of loneliness. They're not afraid of silence. They're afraid of what silence reveals. They're afraid of the unanswerable questions. Why do I always need others to validate my worth? Why do I choose to love someone who doesn't love me back? Am I living the life I want, or am I just repeating someone else's expectations? Those questions, when they arise in solitude, cannot be hidden by excuses. They can only be heard. And if you are patient enough, tolerant enough, courageous enough to stay with them, you begin to change. Not in one magical moment, but little by little. Awareness, feeling, forgiveness. In ancient cultures, there was an interesting thing: people did not avoid the dark. They went into it. The shaman would take you into the forest, into the cave, into the real dark, to find your soul. Solitude, if lived fully, is also a kind of ritual. You are walking in your own wild forest. And that forest, dense and scary as it is not a place where you will be lost. It is a place where you will be found. Not a perfect, unscathed self, but a man who knows his limits, and from there begins to rewrite the story. Once you've faced your shadow, once you've accepted to stay with the rejected parts of yourself, something profound begins to happen. There's no noise, there's no flash of light, like in the movies, just a quiet but clear feeling. Inside you, a seed has been planted. Jung called this process individuation, the journey to becoming a whole person, not the version of yourself that society wants you to be, not the perfect child, the ideal lover, the top employee, but you, whole, no longer divided by roles, masks, or inherited beliefs. This is when you begin to distinguish between who you are and what you've been wearing because you thought you were supposed to be. You begin to see clearly that relationships that hurt you weren't necessarily wrong, but because you stayed with expectations that weren't yours. You realize that there are dreams that were never yours. They were your parents', your teachers', society's, and you've worn them like a tight shirt for years, out of fear of disappointment. In the process of individuation, you don't just let go of things that are no longer true. You also start to remember what made you alive. Maybe you loved to write, to sing, to create, but stopped because you were called unrealistic. Maybe you wanted to live slowly, deeply, authentically, but life pushed you into a cycle of productivity, achievement, and comparison. Individuation is not about becoming someone. It's about going back to what you were before the world started telling you who you should be. And the thing is, this process can only begin when you're quiet enough to listen to your inner voice. When you have the patience to not rush back into the crowd. When you accept that emptiness is not the end, but fertile ground where something truly yours can begin to grow. In the darkness of solitude, the real seeds have a chance to be planted. But like all seeds, it takes time. No one sees the roots growing. No one sees the turning in the ground. But that doesn't mean nothing is happening. On the contrary, it is in that quiet that the biggest changes are quietly taking place. You begin to feel this when the things that once hurt you stop dragging you down as they used to. When you no longer feel the need to explain things to be understood. When you begin to choose to stay with yourself, even when everyone else walks away. These are the first signs that you are entering a rebirth, not by denying the past, but by rearranging it in a new way. You are no longer a fragment. You are becoming a picture. Every part you have rejected, the fear, the fault, the hurt, is now in its proper place. They no longer control you, but they are not buried either. They are acknowledged, integrated, and that gives you a stability that nothing outside of yourself can give. In this journey, you learn to re-establish your relationship with yourself. You begin to ask yourself, what do I need, really? What do I feel right now without anyone else's approval? What is real to me, even if others don't understand? These questions don't lead to immediate answers, but each time you are honest with them, you take another step toward returning. And in this way, you rebuild a strong relationship, not with others, but with yourself. Jung believed that individuation was not just a psychological goal but a spiritual journey. When you become unified within, when you no longer live in fragments, you begin to live with a rare freedom. Freedom comes not from having it all, but from no longer being divided by yourself. And when you touch that, the feeling of being fully yourself, not to please anyone, not to prove anything, a strange thing happens. You no longer feel lonely in the same way. The solitude is still there, but it no longer carries the emptiness. It becomes a sacred space, where you feel your own presence in its entirety. From that moment on, you are no longer afraid of the dark, because you have learned to sow seeds in it. And you know that one day, the seeds will emerge, not to prove anything to the world, but to be true to yourself. A strange thing happens when you stay in the dark long enough. The pain that once crushed you loses its sharpness. The judgmental whispers inside you begin to quiet. And then a thin light, a golden thread in the darkness begins to emerge, not blinding, not glorious, but enough to make you realize you are coming out on the other side. This is not a light that comes from the outside world. It does not come from someone telling you you are wonderful, not from a huge success, not from the approval of the crowd. It comes from within, that place that was once chaotic, now a quiet space, where for the first time you can hear yourself clearly without being drowned out by fear or expectation. The inner light is not loud. It appears silently every time you say no to something that hurts you without explanation. It shines when you are honest with your feelings, even if it is just to say, I am sad, and I accept that. It is powerful when you set boundaries, not out of anger, but because you have learned to protect yourself with self-respect. Little by little, you begin to change the way you show up in the world. It is no longer a constant search for love, but a choice to love yourself first. It is no longer about trying to please everyone, but about being true to what really matters. And the magic is when you stop trying to impress, you become more attractive than ever, because authenticity has an energy that cannot be faked. The stability begins to form from within you. It does not come from no longer being in pain. It comes from the pain no longer having control over you. You may still feel lonely on an afternoon. You may still crave an embrace, someone who understands, but you no longer lose yourself in order to fill that void. You choose to wait. You choose to stay with the lack, because you understand there is no connection more precious than the connection with yourself. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining light, but by making sense of darkness." And now, you are living it. You do not deny your darkness, but you do not let it engulf you either. You understand that true light does not come from erasing the darkness, but from the ability to remain in it, without losing your essence. From this moment, you begin to see the world with different eyes, no longer seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances, but as a learner of them, no longer seeing loneliness as a punishment, but as an opportunity to become a deeper version of yourself. You realize awakening does not come from theory, but from daring to stay when everything in you wants to run away. And when you come out of the darkness, you don't come out with a bright smile, with a perfect appearance. You come out with cracks still there, with wounds not yet completely healed, but with a new strength inside. Quiet, deep, unshakable. You no longer need to prove anything. You don't need people to understand you. You no longer demand love from the outside as salvation, because you have found a deeper kind of love, love from within, for yourself. And that light, however small, is the beginning of a new kind of life, living with awareness, with self-respect, with full presence. A light that is not dependent on conditions, not easily extinguished by the winds of life. A light that once lit will shine silently for the rest of your life, not to show others, but to show you the way back to yourself, whenever you are lost. When the inner light has been lit, when you have stayed with yourself long enough to understand, to forgive, to heal, there comes a natural moment. You come back to the world. But this time, things are not the same. You emerge from the silence, like someone who has just come out of a long winter, and the first thing you notice is the world still operates the same. People are still busy, still in a hurry, still speaking the same stories of success, value, and the things you used to cling to for meaning. But you are different. You no longer hear those sounds with the same ears. You listen with a new depth, and you see more clearly than ever what is real and what is just noise. This change is not always pleasant. Coming back to the world after a deep inner journey is entering another challenging period. You have new values, a new sensibility, a new direction in life, but the world around you doesn't know it. They still call you by the same name. They still expect you to respond the same way. They still expect you to stay the same version they've grown accustomed to. And in that moment, you have to choose. Choose to be faithful to your inner transformation, or to return to your old role in order to be accepted. It's not easy. Your inner awakening isn't always welcome. You may lose some relationships. You may find yourself not fitting in with your old social circles. You may find yourself out of place again, but this time it's different. You don't feel wrong. You no longer feel empty because you don't fit in, because you understand You're not being weird. You're just being real. The truth is often not loud. It doesn't need to be proven, and it doesn't blend in easily, but it has a natural appeal. When you are authentic, you begin to attract the real. New people come into your life, not because you are trying to impress, but because you are no longer trying. They come because of the sincerity you carry, because of the quietness in your eyes, because you don't need them to feel complete, and that makes you whole. You begin to say no, naturally, not in rebellion, but because you know what is yours and what is not. You stop doing things just to be recognized. You stop half-hearted conversations. You choose meaningful presence over presence, to not feel alone. And from there, you rebuild your life. Every relationship, every habit, every choice, from a more real, more solid, more peaceful foundation. Jung once said, "The process of individuation is not complete when you know yourself, but when you bring that true version out into the world." The truth is not just for keeping inside. It must be lived, expressed in your actions, in how you love, how you work, how you treat yourself and others. And that is the final great challenge, to be yourself in a world that often discourages it. You are no longer who you were, but you are not separate from the world either. You can now be present in it without being swallowed up. You can love without losing yourself. You can listen without pleasing. You can give without holding back. Solitude has taught you a rare skill, to stand alone without being rigid, to be soft without being brittle. The world is the same, but you are not, and that changes everything. There is a moment that often comes quietly, without fanfare, without flashy lights. No one tells you that you have come a long way, but you feel it. Maybe it is on a quiet morning, when you open your eyes and find that your heart is not as heavy as before. Maybe it is when you face an old challenge, but this time you do not collapse. Or when you have been alone all day, and instead of feeling empty, you feel at peace. That is a sign that you have gone through the fire. You are no longer the same person, but you are not in a hurry to become someone new. You are just being yourself, whole, complete, right now. And with that transformation, a new door begins to open. Jung believed that the inner journey does not stop with personal healing. It must be brought back into the world. When you have met yourself in solitude, when you have sat with the shadow and found the light, the greatest gift is not just your own stability, but how you show up in this life. You don't have to stand on a podium to teach. You don't have to write books, form groups, or be speakers. Just by being authentic, every day, you become a silent reminder to those around you. In a world crazy for performance, you choose presence. In a society tired of chasing standards, you choose to be true to what you feel. Your silence is a gift. Not because it is perfect, but because it is true. You no longer strive to be understood, and that makes you more relatable. You no longer need things to be easy, and that makes you more resilient. You know how to stay with sadness, and you also know how to hold on to joy, regardless of conditions. You become the kind of person the world needs. Someone who listens not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Someone who doesn't talk much, but whose words carry weight. Someone who doesn't promise much, but is truly present. Someone who isn't loud, but whose presence makes others feel allowed to be themselves. And then something magical happens. People who are also lost begin to seek you out. They don't know why, they just feel the safety of your energy. They sit next to you and feel understood, even though you haven't said anything, not because you have great advice, but because you've walked through their pain. You're no longer afraid of the silence between you, because you've learned to sit in your own silence. And that's a rare gift. This is when you realize loneliness is not a mistake. It's a ritual, a journey that softens the hard ego, an irrevocable encounter with your true self. And when you have walked that path, you do not need to go back to being the same person. You do not need to run back to where you used to be, because now you belong to yourself. Now you carry loneliness as a sacred souvenir, not a scar, but a kind of certificate, a silent confirmation that you dared to look at the part that others often avoid. And so you live differently, you choose differently, you love differently, you listen differently. The world will continue to turn at its own pace, but you have found your own rhythm, no longer rushing to keep up, no longer needing to compare to assert yourself. You know when to move forward, when to stop, and especially, you know when to return to the inner space where the silence once nurtured you. So you begin to practice this as a private ritual. You return to loneliness actively, not because you were left behind, but because you chose to withdraw. Not because you're sad, but because you know that silence is where you reconnect with your truest self. It becomes a place of refuge, a place of recovery, a place of rebirth. Loneliness now is no longer your enemy. It is the fire that has tempered you. It is the darkness that has shown you the light. It is the desert that has taught you to dig a well in the ground. And when you understand that, you no longer fear the empty seasons. You welcome them like old friends, knowing that each time you return you will emerge a deeper version of yourself. Carl Jung once said, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens." Now you are awakened, not by a thunderclap, but by walking silently into the darkest place and finding the light that cannot be extinguished. And that is why you have nothing to prove. You don't need the world to tell you that you've grown up, because you've known, you've lived, and you've become. And if someone is lost right now, drowning in a loneliness that seems to have no way out, you can look at them with a knowing gaze and whisper, "You're not lost, you're just on your way home."